Right now, while you're watching this, the U.S. national debt just grew by another $68,902. That happened in the 1 second it took you to read that sentence. Now it happened again. And again, this isn't a distant political problem. It's not something that lives in a spreadsheet in Washington. It is the hidden engine behind why your mortgage payment feels impossible, why your grocery bill blindsides you every week, and why your retirement plan quietly loses ground even when the stock market is up. Today, we're going to walk through exactly how America's debt spiral works. Not with economic jargon, not with partisan spin, but with real numbers, real people, and a real timeline that should concern every single person watching this. And we'll get to the one question that nobody in power seems willing to answer honestly. Stay with me, because this gets darker before it gets hopeful, and both parts matter. Section 1. The number that changed everything. Let's start with the scale, because without it, nothing else makes sense. As of March 2026, the total U.S. national debt stands at $38.86 trillion. If that number doesn't hit you physically, let me reframe it. The entire U.S. economy, every product sold, every service rendered, every salary paid an entire year, that's called GDP. It totals about $31.5 trillion. America's debt is now 122% of everything produces in a year. That means if the U.S. shut down every school, every hospital, every highway project, every military base, every government program, and redirected all economic output to just paying back the debt, it would still take more than a year and 2 months to wipe the slate clean. Now here's where history starts flashing warning lights. In 2000, the debt-to-GDP ratio was around 55%, manageable, even comfortable by most economic standards. In 2008, as the financial crisis hit, it was 68%, high, but still within historical precedent. Then COVID happened. The government, to its credit, threw enormous money at preventing total economic collapse. By early 2021, debt spiked to 130.3% of GDP, the highest since World War II. After the war, America grew its way out. The economy exploded, taxes poured in, and debt as a share of GDP fell for decades. This time, the debt didn't fall. It stabilized briefly, and now it's climbing again. But that's not the most alarming part. The most alarming part is the speed. In fiscal year 2025 alone, the national debt grew by $2.17 trillion. That's $5.95 billion every single day. $248 million every hour. $4 million every minute. That rate is not slowing down. The Congressional Budget Office projects debt hitting 156% of GDP by 2055, and that's the baseline scenario, not a worst case. But before we go further, let me tell you about Marcus. Section 2, Marcus, Columbus, Ohio. Marcus spent 35 years as a postal carrier in Columbus, Ohio. Every paycheck, he set money aside. He maxed out his pension contributions. He wasn't rich, but by the time he retired at 61, he felt like he'd done everything right. Then inflation hit. Between 2021 and 2023, cumulative inflation in the U.S. ran over 17%. Marcus's fixed pension payment bought less every single month. His grocery bill, just for 2 people, jumped from around $280 a month to over $490. But here's the part that nobody explained to Marcus. The government's interest payments on its debt in fiscal year 2024 hit $879.9 billion, more than the entire defense budget, more than Medicare. That interest bill has to come from somewhere. It crowds out spending on everything else. Social programs, infrastructure, the very systems that people like Marcus depend on. Marcus started doing his own research. He moved a portion of his supplemental savings into I-bonds, Treasury instruments that adjust for inflation, and into TIPS, Treasury inflation-protected securities. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it buffered the blow. I wish I'd known this 20 years ago, he told a community financial literacy group last year. Nobody teaches you that the government's credit card bill affects your grocery bill. Marcus is one of 56 million Americans currently receiving Social Security. The system funding those payments? It is under structural pressure that is now measurably greater than at any point in its history. Which brings us to the thing that keeps economists up at night. Section 3. The debt spiral and why it's different this time. A debt spiral sounds abstract. It isn't. It happens when a government must borrow new money just to pay the interest on the money it already borrowed. Not to build anything, not to fund anything, just to service the debt. In fiscal year 2025, the United States paid $952 billion in net interest on its national debt. $952 billion. Approaching $1 trillion. For nothing. No new roads. No new schools. No new anything. Just the cost of having borrowed so much for so long. The Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan economic watchdog of Congress, projects that over the next decade, the U.S. will pay $16.2 trillion in interest on its debt. That's more than the current entire national debt of China. And here's where a credit rating downgrade changes the trajectory. In May 2025, Moody's, one of the world's 3 major credit rating agencies, downgraded the United States from AAA to AA1. This was the first U.S. credit downgrade since 1917. A lower credit rating means investors demand higher interest rates to compensate for the higher perceived risk. Higher interest rates on new debt mean the interest bill grows even faster, which means more borrowing, which means the rating potentially falls further. This is what economists mean by a spiral. It feeds itself. For context, S&P downgraded the U.S. in 2011. Fitch followed in 2023. Now Moody's has joined them. All 3 of the major rating agencies now agree. America is no longer their top-rated borrower. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but this is abstract government stuff. How does it actually touch me? Let me show you exactly. Section 4. Your wallet, your mortgage, your future. The transmission mechanism from Washington's debt to your bank account runs through a thing called the Treasury yield. When the government needs to borrow money, it sells Treasury bonds. The interest rate on those bonds, the yield, is set by what investors demand. The higher the perceived risk of U.S. debt, the higher the yield they require. And Treasury yields are the foundation of almost every interest rate in America. Your mortgage, your car loan, your credit card, your small business loan. They're all benchmarked in various ways to treasuries. When Treasury yields rise, everything rises. Here's what that means in concrete dollars. A $400,000 home mortgage at 4% interest costs you $1,909 per month. That same mortgage at 7.5% interest costs you $2,797 per month. That's $888 more every single month. Over 30 years, that's $319,680 extra. Not for a bigger house, not for a better neighborhood, just for the financial environment you happen to buy into. The 30-year mortgage rate hit 7.79% in October 2023, a 23-year high, directly following the Fitch downgrade and Treasury yield surge. This is not coincidence. It is causation, and it doesn't stop at mortgages. The Congressional Budget Office found that for every new dollar the government borrows, private investment drops by 33 cents. Economists call this crowding out. Government debt competes with private borrowing for the same pool of capital, and when the government is borrowing $5.95 billion a day, private businesses, entrepreneurs, and families are the ones who get squeezed out. CBO's analysis concludes that rising debt under current law will reduce average American income by nearly 6% by 2055 compared to a scenario where debt was stabilized. 6% might sound small, but applied to a median household earning $75,000, that's $4,500 a year, every year, an income that evaporates because Washington couldn't balance its books, which is where Sandra's story comes in. Section 5. Sandra, Atlanta, Georgia. Sandra had a dream she'd carried for years. She'd spent 2 decades working in commercial kitchens and raised her daughter while building her savings. In 2024, she was finally ready. She walked into a bank and applied for an SBA small business loan to open a bakery. The quoted rate, 11.5%. Sandra's credit score was excellent. Her business plan was reviewed by a score mentor and called solid. The bank wasn't being punitive. That was just the market rate. In a high treasury yield environment, the numbers didn't pencil. She walked out without the loan. She could have quit. She didn't. Instead, Sanders started selling at 2 Atlanta farmers markets on weekends. She built a social media following. She started a pre-order subscription model, $85 a month for weekly artisan loaves and pastries, and within 8 months had 200 subscribers generating consistent revenue. She's now planning to open her brick and mortar in 2026, funded largely by customer deposits and small personal contributions from early supporters. The system wasn't built for people like me in a rate environment like this, she said, so I built around it. Sanders' resilience is extraordinary, but it shouldn't have been necessary. A functional fiscal environment, where interest rates reflect economic conditions rather than government credit stress, would have funded her dream in year one. Not everyone has Sanders' determination. Most people just don't open the bakery. And that lost business, that unrealized job creation, that economic activity that never happened, multiplied by millions of Sanders across America, that is the silent cost of fiscal dysfunction. Section 6. The scenario nobody wants to talk about. Now, we need to talk about something serious. Because there's a gap between the debt is high and growing, which is bad but manageable, and what economists call a sudden stop. A sudden stop happens when foreign investors who hold U.S. Treasury debt lose confidence, suddenly, collectively, and either stop buying new bonds or, worse, begin selling the ones they hold. Today, foreign governments and private investors hold approximately 30% of all U.S. public debt. Japan holds $1.1 trillion. The United Kingdom holds $809 billion. China holds $756 billion. Their confidence in U.S. fiscal management isn't just a diplomatic nicety. It is structurally embedded in the price of everything you buy, borrow, and earn. If those investors, for any reason, geopolitical, economic, or simply loss of confidence, started reducing their treasury holdings at scale, the effect would cascade. Treasury yield would surge to attract new buyers. Mortgage rates would spike. Consumer borrowing would freeze. Business investment would collapse. The dollar would weaken sharply, making imports, including oil, electronics, and medications, dramatically more expensive. Inflation and recession at the same time. Stagflation, the worst economic combination. This has happened before, not in America, but in countries that also believe they were too important to fail. Argentina, 2001. Greece, 2010. Turkey, 2018. Each experienced versions of the scenario. In each case, ordinary citizens who had done nothing wrong, saved responsibly, followed the rules, woke up to find their savings devalued, their pension promises broken, their economies in freefall. America is not Argentina. The U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency, a structural advantage that provides enormous buffering capacity. But here's the uncomfortable data point. The dollar's share of global reserves has fallen from 71% in 2000 to 58% in 2024, according to the IMF. That structural advantage is real, and it is slowly eroding. The speed matters. If fiscal consolidation happens before the erosion reaches a critical threshold, the U.S. navigates this without catastrophe. If it doesn't, former Fed Chair Ben Bernanke, IMF Managing Director Christine Lagarde, and 17 Nobel Prize-winning economists signed a letter warning of what they called a potential fiscal event, their careful language for something they didn't want to say plainly in public. That was their version of a warning shot. Section 7. The real exit ramps. Here's what I don't want to do. Leave you with fear and no path forward. Because exit ramps exist. They are real. They have worked in other countries. And they could work here if there's political will. Lever 1. Revenue reform. The Joint Committee on Taxation estimated that the U.S. tax code contains roughly $2.2 trillion in annual tax expenditures, legal deductions, credits, and loopholes that predominantly benefit corporations and high-wealth individuals. That is not a partisan statement. It is a bipartisan accounting fact. Closing even a fraction of those gaps generates meaningful fiscal room without raising headline tax rates. Lever 2. Spending efficiency. Medicare spending grew from 2.2% of GDP in 2000 to 3.9% in 2025. By 2050, it's projected to hit 6.2% of GDP, with no corresponding improvement in health outcomes per dollar. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget has identified $7.5 trillion in credible deficit reductions needed over 10 years to stabilize the debt trajectory. The proposals exist. The political support hasn't materialized. Lever 3, growth. This is the least painful lever. Every additional percentage point of annual GDP growth meaningfully changes the debt-to-GDP ratio. Pro-growth policies, infrastructure investment, education, immigration reform that addresses workforce gaps, and research and development incentives have historically generated returns that ease fiscal stress. Not a silver bullet, but a real multiplier. And we have a case study that worked. Canada in the mid-1990s faced a debt-to-GDP ratio of 68% and a fiscal crisis that had international investors nervous. Between 1994 and 2000, the Canadian government cut federal programs spending by 10%, reformed pensions, and restructured federal-provincial funding relationships. It was painful. It was politically costly. And by 2000, Canada was running surpluses, and its debt to GDP was falling. Canada's economy didn't collapse. It accelerated. Because when creditors trust you, borrowing costs fall, investment flows in, and the whole system breathes. America has the same playbook available to it. What it lacks so far is a political will to use it. Section 8, the clock and what you can do. Here is the timeline that gives me the most concern. The Social Security Retirement Trust Fund is currently projected to hit insolvency within 7 years. At that point, under current law, benefits would be automatically cut by 24% for all 70 million plus recipients. No politician wants to say that out loud. So most don't, but the trustees' report says it every year, in plain numbers, and has for 2 decades. The CBO projects the annual deficit growing from $1.8 trillion in FI 2025 to $6.4 trillion by FI 2055. Not because of future wars or future pandemics, but simply because of the commitments already made to an aging population in a high-interest rate environment. A child born in America today arrives on this earth already responsible for approximately $112,000 of national debt. That child didn't vote, didn't choose, didn't borrow. That is just the inherited consequence of fiscal decisions made before they were born. So what can you actually do on the personal finance side? And this matters more the longer this continues. Lock in fixed-rate debt now, before rate environments worsen. Build an emergency fund of 6 to 12 months in a high-yield savings account. Look at I-bonds and TIPS as inflation hedges. Consider modest international diversification in your investment portfolio as a hedge against dollar volatility. None of these are perfect. All of them reduce your personal exposure to macro uncertainty. On the civic side, because this ultimately only changes through democracy, vote with fiscal responsibility as a genuine criterion at the national and local level. Contact your congressional representatives, the people whose staff fields constituent calls and counts them. Those numbers influence legislative priorities more than most people believe. Support organizations like the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, the Bipartisan Policy Center, or the Peterson Foundation, which do nonpartisan debt reduction work regardless of who is in power. And honestly, keep watching, keep learning, and keep talking about this. The greatest risk to fixing the debt isn't economic. It's attention. People look away because it's overwhelming, abstract, and slow-moving. It is not slow-moving. It is growing at $68,902 per second. Here's where I land. There are 2 camps of serious people on this issue. Camp 1 says, the United States is fundamentally different from every country that has faced debt crisis before. The dollar's reserve currency status, the depth of U.S. financial markets, and the country's demonstrated ability to generate growth create a buffer that historical analogies don't capture. We've been warned about debt collapse since Reagan. The warning has never come true. And every generation that shorted U.S. financial resilience eventually got burned. Camp 2 says, every system has a breaking point. The dollar's reserve status is not a law of physics. It is a matter of confidence. And confidence, once lost, does not return gradually. The same people who were unconcerned about Greece's debt in 2008 were watching Greek pensioners line up outside empty ATMs in 2010. Both camps have Nobel Prize-winning economists. Both have serious data. So here's my question for you, and I want your actual opinion in the comments. Do you think America will fix its debt problem before a crisis forces it to? Or will it take a crash first? There's no wrong answer, just an honest one. And if you have a friend, a parent, a colleague who thinks this is abstract and doesn't touch their life, send them this video, because the debt doesn't care whether you're paying attention. It's growing right now while you decide.